Sorry, yeah. First of all, I would like to. I'm really saddened that this has happened to the family of Jimmy. I know the parents well. They're very lovely people, and they should not be having to face this continuing barrage of unfortunate news. I'm also saddened that after serving over 14 years in prison, that this young man, hasn't really learned a lesson, and I now feel, what kind of support do they have in prison to really look into that mindset and change that mindset? I'm all for positivity. I don't want to stop artistic creation around the music, but when it impacts people talk about murder and really horrendous things that they would like to do or have done, it's only right that he's recalled back to reflect on his action.
I agree with you, Ken. I think I'm disappointed. Not only has Jimmy's family unnecessarily had to go through the pain of reliving the trauma, as you rightly say, and I'm delighted they've had someone like you in their home to actually support them or give them advice, and as someone who will understand about this issue better than most, I am deeply upset as well that, as you say, a 14-year sentence has not been enough of a lesson for an individual to understand that glamorising the horrific crime they committed does not show any remorse whatsoever, and they're fortunate, in my opinion, to be walking the streets. I personally believe, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'm happy for you to challenge me, Ken, that people like this should be locked up indefinitely, that they are dangerous to society. They cannot be reformed if they're willing to carry knives or guns or indeed use other weapons in order to commit horrific crimes. Am I wrong in that? Can people really reform?
I will have to disagree with you because I'm living example of a person who's changed. Because as a young man, I was incarcerated for things I've done, and I'm not saying everyone comes about change, but I found the change in me. From being a selfish person, I now become selfless to help other vulnerable people. I'm not comfortable with what I did as a young man, but nonetheless, I had to take the bull by the horn and really go out there and try to make a difference in my community. And fortunately, I find as a mentor, as part of other groups, Community Against Violence, actually going and having that street engagement with these youngsters to try to change their mindset and get them to recognise that we all got the red mist in us and trauma, but if we can give them the tool to recognise it and to deal with it more effectively, that's the positive things in my life.
Now, do you personally think, Ken,
as it happened to me, and as I said, I'm living proof it can work.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, Ken, and I accept that people can change, and I think that was a good lesson for me, to be perfectly frank. Now, I'm keen to get your view here. Is this more of a failure of the parole board? Because surely they should have been aware of Mr. Fahri's movements. They should have been monitoring him much more closely, as well as providing him the necessary support that he may have needed upon his release. Is this a systemic problem with our parole system that you're finding from the work that you do with those who have offended and are coming out and trying to rehabilitate, as well as victims' families of these horrific crimes? Do you think the parole board is actually ultimately to blame here?
I don't think so. I don't believe the parole board, or I don't think probation, who's undermanned, and they just really got too much casework. I feel it's a failure of the young man himself, because he has to hold himself accountable. And fortunately, we've got things in place, safeguards in place that, like the Sun, that can unmask people like Ted, and also make the BBC realise that they've also got a responsibility for the sort of music that they're pushing out there, because it does have an adverse effect on young people in my community.
And do you think we need to see much more proactive community engagement from our police forces? Do we need to see more stop and search? I'd be someone who said to Staffordshire Police, I'll happily share it with you, my chief constable, I said that the most prolific knife carriers in our community and drug runners, they should be harassed and stopped and searched on a daily basis so we can lock them up for good for when they eventually make a mistake, to get them off our streets. These are the people wreaking havoc on many of our communities. Is tough law and order what we need, or would you argue that actually we need to have more of a caring approach? I know that many, I'll be frank, conservative colleagues of mine would talk regularly about actually we need to be preventative, and when those who have been arrested have ended up in prison, we need to see much more focused on the rehabilitation of an individual rather than someone like me who is much more about find the criminal, lock them up and throw away the key.
That's only kicking the ball down the further down the road, because when that person comes out, who's coming back out in our community? My thing is, stop and search has a role to play, but that role has to be intelligent led, because currently less than 3% of their stop and search is for weapons. And what I find that is really disturbing, less than 12% of their stop and search lead to an arrest. So that 78% leads to no arrest, and much of that, 7% of that, it leads to no further action. But the interaction between that, with the police and that young person could lead to, first of all, that person being stopped and scarred, and secondly, that person no longer happiness to the police. Instead of going to police when something happens to them, like they've suffered a victim of crime, they take the law into their own hands. It's unacceptable for anyone out there to walk with any kind of weapon. If you feel you have to walk with a weapon, then I would advise you, don't go out, stay in.
Can I say, thank you so much, Ken, for joining us. That's Ken Hines, who's a knife crime campaigner and stop and search campaigner as well. It was good to have his view on the show. Dan, I thought I'd quickly come to you there. Ken's talking about the fact that most stop and search doesn't actually lead to arrest, and that actually the interaction is important to monitor because it could lead people to become disaffected. What do you think? Do you think stop and search is a good tool, a useful tool, a tool that should be used much more by our forces?
I have to say I agree with a lot of what Ken said there, particularly about the ability for people to change. On stop and search, it's one of the tools in the toolbox. I think actually one of the questions that isn't being talked about with this very sad and tragic case is the role social media is playing. Social media is glorifying violence. This chap had a YouTube channel where obviously he was having hits on his videos and potentially income from YouTube driven by the algorithm to then promote it to more young people. Social media is not a good thing in this age, and I actually think that needs to be looked at as well.
Do you think we have a good enough parole system? I mean, in Stoke-on-Trent we've got a number of charities that work with those who have left prison to rehouse them, rehome them, as well as obviously then use services supplied by the city council, the local council. I think this is important for listeners to understand. That interaction of, everyone thinks the MP does everything, actually the councils are very important in what they do.